Hello, BRC family. Pastor Jay here again for week 5, discussing chapter 4 of How to Revive Evangelism. This chapter covers the topic called experience, not just explanation. So we're a little over halfway now through this study. I hope that you have been able to shift some ideas in your head of what evangelism could look like, or what it should look like, what it might look like. But if I were to pick a chapter that our entire church needs to read and study, this would be the one. There's a long story that I don't have to tell you that is the why behind our congregation and our denomination and our history that doesn't focus on experience. So yeah, if you want to, you can go back and watch my lectures on church history if you want to hear more about that. But this is one thing I think we need to change here at the church, and one thing that we need to work on. So, the chapter started out with the story about a man named Alan. That wasn't his real name, but that's what we called him. That's what he called him in the book. And Alan, I'm sure everybody knows somebody that's like Alan, detail-oriented, has to break everything down, has to look at everything. And that's not a bad thing. That's just who he is. That's his personality, if you will, of overanalyzation of things. And probably everybody has somebody like Alan in their life. But Alans can be difficult in the church. They need to make sure that everything's going correctly and that everything lines up just perfectly. And sometimes, and I'm not saying this, that faith isn't real, but sometimes in faith, not everything lines up perfectly. But at that moment in which Alan experienced God, he went from needing to have everything line up perfectly to seeing the reality in a very different way. He went from contemplating a philosophy to encountering a reality, and those are very different things. Because we can talk for hours about philosophy up here, right? It's above our heads. It's in the ethos, if you want to use the $2 word, Greek word for the day, if you will, going back to what Philosophy 101 in college. But that's it. That's just talk. But when we experience God, there's no more talk. It's there. It's a reality. It becomes real like gravity, is what he said. Alan had given himself fully to Jesus, and his heart and his life began to change even more after that one experience. He went from seeking an explanation about God to experiencing God, and his journey didn't stop there. Of course, we know at the end of the chapter, we'll talk about it again, but what an amazing story of a person whose life was changed because of an experience with God. Chapter goes on then. We could talk forever about that, but I do want to keep these a little shorter than we possibly could in the past. And so it goes on in the book to talk a little more about a passage that he came back to from Hebrews, where it says that the gospel, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of those who believe. And that passage alone, that verse alone, changes our mindset. It changed his mindset, the author, at least, as he said, I mean, this is him talking in the first person, said, I was acting as if the key to evangelism was people knowing enough about the gospel. I seemed to believe and lead as if the gospel could be fully understood and internalized through explanation alone. I realized I needed to depend more on the power of God, the experience of God, especially when it comes to evangelism. That's a pretty clear statement of someone who realized that they were doing something wrong and then needed to change and shift gears and shift direction. And because of that one passage, that the salvation of people belongs to the power of God, not the explanation of God. That was a very eye-opening experience for him. And to be honest, it was pretty eye-opening for me as well, because I think we at BRC are very good at explaining God, hopefully in understandable terms. But we are not necessarily very good at creating a space for experiencing God to take place. It's something we can work on. The door's not closed. I'm not saying that, the sky's falling. None of that. But we need to improve somewhere. I think this is an area we can improve. I liked the statement on page 99. It said that non-Christians would increase their interest in faith if they had an eye-opening spiritual experience themselves. And I understand where he's coming from. People long for that, he said. They long to feel a connection with the ultimate power who created them, who has a purpose for them, and who loves them. It's a huge deal when you find that person in your life. And it would be a huge deal to experience God in that way as well. It's life-changing. It's eye-opening. It's completely different for people. He goes on to talk about Luke chapter 5 and Peter's experience of God. And it caused Peter to do 4 different things. The first thing Peter did was Peter worshiped Jesus. When he understood and experienced what just took place, he knew that Jesus was special. So he took time and he worshiped him in a real way. Secondly, he confessed his sins. He was able to see the difference between who Jesus was and who he was. And he wanted to be more like Jesus, so he confessed the areas of his life that were not like Jesus. And all of us need to do that on a regular basis. And then thirdly, Jesus gives Peter a new identity. This is the big moment. This is the conversion experience. This is the life-changing trajectory that took place when Jesus gave Peter a new identity. And number 4, which is also important, is that Peter then followed Jesus. He could have just stopped there, taken his new identity and gone off and done his own thing, but he realized, nope, this is where I need to continue to follow Jesus. This is not the end for me. It's actually a new beginning. Those experiences can be life-changing and life-altering. So, one more quote for us as we continue to move on for this. In page 103, he says, when we lead people into spaces where they can experience God, we aren't only unleashing the power of God in their lives. God will begin to move out from them to their friends and their family and their neighbors. It's like a rock tossed into the middle of a pond, and the ripples spread outward, reaching all the way to the farthest bank. So we'll come back to this point as well, but it's a good thing for us to think about, is that when we can allow people to experience God, it doesn't just affect them. They're going to tell people about it, and it's going to spread and build like ripples on a pond. And that's a great thing to understand. We'll talk a little bit more when we get into the next couple of chapters where we're talking about doing things together collectively and how much more that can ripple effect to more and more people. But yeah, I think the point is very, very clear in here, is that people want to have an experience with God. And maybe, just maybe, that's something that scares us. Let me explain what I mean by that. Because if people don't experience God, maybe they'll use that as a reason to not come to church or not come to know Christ. And we have no control over who God chooses to have an experience with and who he doesn't, right? I can spend all my time each and every day crafting the perfect words to say in these videos, the perfect words to say in a sermon, or what to say when I speak to someone, to have every single answer nailed down. I can control that. But I cannot control someone having an experience with God unless we just create the space and allow God to do his work. Sometimes not being in control scares us. And we need to understand that. We need to admit that. We need to possibly even confess that up to God and then allow him to work. Because honestly, our best efforts are like dirty rags to God. That's in Scripture. Look that one up. Some good things that we should understand is that our best efforts are nothing compared to the righteousness of God. So he's going to show up. He's going to create an experience if we give him the space to do so. If we want evangelism to revive, we must move away from relying on explanation alone and lead people into a space where they can experience God. That was like the thesis statement of the whole chapter he made on page 105. But then he goes on, he doesn't just stop there, because that would be kind of mean, just to say this is what we need to do and I'm not going to tell you how. But so what can we do in order to facilitate these life-changing encounters with God? There's 5 listed things that we can do, listed between pages 105 and 107. Number 1 is ask ourselves the fundamental questions. Do I regularly have experiences with the living God? I think a lot of people in our congregation and even on our leadership team might say, I don't know, or no. Some would say yes, and that's great. But I don't know is probably the most often answer that we would receive for that. Well, that's something that we need to change. We need to create some God experience spaces in our own lives and watch God work, trust in Him, hand over the reins, if you will. Jesus, take the wheel. That's why that song was so important, is we know God can be in control if we let go of that wheel. And that's how we can really have some experiences with God. Thing number 2, where is God at work already? Here's the biggest thing. Too often, people, pastors, leaders in the church tell God their plans and hope that God will go alongside with that. It's not always the best thing to do. What we need to do is we need to ask God or find out where God is working, and therefore we can then come alongside what He's already doing. That's the key. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to come up with something completely different. We need to find out where is God at work, and then we need to come alongside Him in that work. Number 3 is we need to listen and pay attention. Another thing that we are not necessarily very good at in America is listening to others or listening to God and paying attention, watching and seeing what He's doing. It's a learned skill to see what God is doing in the world. And listening, again, going back a couple chapters, listening is a learned skill too that we need to work on instead of just telling God everything that's going on and telling Him what we're going to do. Number 4 is pray. That's how we communicate with the Lord. We go back and forth. Again, it's a two-way street. It's not just a one-way street. And God will answer our prayers. Maybe not the way we want Him to, but He will answer our prayers. And then number 5, very practical thing, is we need to create the space for God to show up. We need to have times where that can take place. And I will admit, one of the greatest spaces that we do create to have God show up, we call them reconciliation and renewal weekends. A lot of people have experienced them here at BRC, men and women both, and it's been a great time to experience God. But we need to do that more than just once a year or one weekend out of a year. We need to understand and create more spaces for God to come to work in our regular lives here at the church. One last statistic then he gives, it says somewhere around 70% of those who have decided to follow Jesus had some kind of supernatural experience that moved them over the line, leading them to make that decision. Now, explanation is important. Hear me say that too. I want to agree. We need to continue to explain things, but those efforts cannot stand on their own because the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of those who believe. So we're not going to continue, or not going to quit explaining. We're not going to quit using logic and reason to learn about truth. But we need to create more space, add something to what we're doing to allow people to experience the power of God. Some questions that you'll be discussing here today. Have you ever had an eye-opening experience of the Spirit of God? What contributed to that moment and what helped open your eyes? Think back in your life to what you may have experienced. Do you think the non-Christians in your life are open to an experience or just an explanation? What is the next step you can take to explore that question with them? Are they open to experiencing God, and how can you create that space for someone specific? Think of a face and a name for this question. Does our church, BRC, create space for people outside the faith to have an eye-opening experience of God's presence as part of their journey towards Christ? If the answer is no, I'd love some suggestions on how we can do that a little bit better here at BRC. And then number 4 are pair up and brainstorm ways that you individually, or you as your small group, or we as a church can be a place that people can experience God and not just have Him explained. So that's thinking back to your answer to number 1. Where did you experience God? Have you experienced God? How can we create spaces here at BRC to do that on a more regular basis? Thank you for continuing to do this story. Keep reading the book, keep discussing. I hope you're all enjoying this and learning and continuing to grow together. Thanks so much and have a great week. Bye-bye.